Welcome to Superhero Rundown. I'm Jess, and today we're going to look at what makes a man, or a masculine hero at least. And what better way to do that than look at the 5 gentlemen that make up the front and center of Watchmen. Before people get all uppity about me not covering the show, I have to wait until the season is finished before I can find a good topic for it. So that's why we're doing the movie. So before I jump into Five Guys, the character, not the burger place. Man, I really need to stop doing this when I'm hungry and angry. Okay, so before we jump into these guys, damn it, we need to explore the world of Watchmen first. Masculinity is defined as a set of attributes, behaviors, and/or roles associated with men and boys. It's socially constructed, but most sociologists believe that biology plays a role. But we don't know what extent that biology does influence masculinity, as all genders can exhibit masculine traits. You know, stuff like strength, courage, independence, leadership, and assertiveness. You know, masculine traits that guys show, but there's more to it than that. So we're going to look at the world of Watchmen before we jump into these guys. This is just going to be a complete episode of sexual innuendo, isn't it?
Jesus, Dad.
In Men of Steel, Rorschach, Theweleit, and Watchmen's Deconstructed Masculinity, we learned that as a representative of a particular brand of 20th century American hegemonic masculinity, the superhero usually embodies the tough, uncompromising masculine virtues of the American nation. Virtues that originate from the frontier myth and which can be located in other popular fictions of America, such as westerns and detective fiction, which tend to embrace the idea of masculine essence instead of a plurality of masculinities. So, to briefly explain Watchmen, I'm going to explain the setting and the importance of Watchmen in its own universe, because manliness? Look, this isn't exactly my cup of tea here, but masculinity needs to be discussed, so here we go. Watchmen takes place in 1985, in an alternate reality where Nixon is somehow still president and still a shitty person, so good to know some things are forever, in every universe. Anyway, in the world of Watchmen, there are superheroes, but the only one who has any real superhuman abilities is Dr. Manhattan. And the Vietnam War ended in 1971 thanks to him, and the Watergate scandal never happened. Ugh! It's like, in any universe, the world is just full of shitty rich white people. That's so fucking depressing. So, when we pick up in 1985, Dr. Manhattan's very existence has given the United States an advantage over the Soviet Union, and thus has increased Cold War tensions. We also learned that by 1977, superheroes had grown unpopular among the public and police. But honestly, who cares what the police think when they are gunning down people for being black? To the point of them being outlawed on passing of the Keene Act. Dr. Manhattan and the comedian operate as government agents on the payroll. Night Owl and Ozymandias have since retired, and Rorschach continues to be a vigilante outside the law. I'm going to talk about these five guys in a specific order. We're going to start with Night Owl, then jump to Dr. Manhattan, the comedian, Ozymandias, and finally Rorschach. Night Owl is probably the most mild-mannered out of all of the men. He's an awkward nerd type who happens to be charming. He has morals and he's a little too nice to assert himself. And it's nice because he's one of only 3 people who are actually decent in this movie. The other 2 being that kid that's reading the pirate comic and Comedian's corpse. Because the comedian's greatest redeeming quality is that he's dead now. What I really want to highlight about Night Owl, though, is that he is consistently a nice person and has one major slip-up in the entirety of the movie. When we see him leaving Hollis Mason's house, the two have just had a conversation about the origins of superheroes and the masked men who fought crime.
You ever miss it? No. You? No, heck no.
In that short exchange, we can tell that Daniel, the currently retired Night Owl, actually misses crime fighting quite a bit. It's also a telling example of how men are expected to mask their emotions, that they need to be strong and not feel anything. The interesting thing is that this scene is capped off with a mechanic sign that says, "Obsolete models a specialty," and a billboard that reads, "Nostalgia by Vite." These 2 visual narrative pieces illustrate both Daniel and Hollis are past their prime and long for the days before the Keene Act had outlawed superheroes. And when Laurie leaves Dr. Manhattan, Daniel is sympathetic and willing to listen. I mean, the guy even invites her to go get a beer at Hollis's place. Later in the film, Dan explains about his background. His dad was a corporate banker, but Daniel was more interested in crime fighting and birds. He felt a genuine connection to Hollis and now to Lori, but when she mentions Manhattan, he gets visibly discouraged. He doesn't say anything and continues to support her. When Daniel has a nightmare, he tells Lori he's tired of being afraid of everything. Lori suggests that they go fight crime at 3 a.m. Like Batman. So they go out and help people escape a fire and then make love in the sky, complete with a money shot. I feel like this is the film asserting that Daniel has had his effeminateness stripped away and he's a man's man again. Not saying it's good, just pointing it out. After that, they go break Rorschach out of prison, realizing he was framed for the death of a former supervillain. They fight their way through the prison with both Daniel and Lori being in sync.
Oh, it's because they had sexual relations, you see.
After Manhattan appears and takes Lori to Mars, Dan finally agrees to do things Rorschach's way, by capitulating to Rorschach's demands. They go to a bar to get information. They resolve to follow the money to find who killed the comedian, but on the way out, Daniel learns of Hollis's murder. He has a fit and beats the hell out of a guy until Rorschach, of all people, stops him and says,
Daniel, not in front of the civilians.
At Ozymandias' office, Daniel hacks into the computer and finds out that Ozymandias had the comedian killed, Manhattan exiled, and most of the events of the movie can be traced back to him. When they fight Ozymandias, Daniel remarks that
we were supposed to make the world a better place.
But not at the expense of war and human extinction. When Manhattan comes to Antarctica to stop Ozymandias, Daniel attacks the latter after the death of Rorschach, but Ozymandias doesn't fight back because Daniel is expressing grief over the murder of his friend. And at the end of the film, Daniel reassures Lori that as long as the world thinks that Dr. Manhattan is watching, there's no need to fear. Speaking of, Dr. Manhattan is the only superhuman in the Watchmen universe. I think the article in praise of Zack Snyder's Watchmen puts it best. In a world of heroes, Dr. Manhattan is the only character in Watchmen with actual superpowers, ones that make him wade through the world and its problems like someone playing a video game with all the cheat codes unlocked. He's so godlike. An incomplete list of his powers include the ability to manipulate matter, telekinesis, teleportation, limited clairvoyance, and possible immortality. That he struggles to still register as human, an emotional detachment that Billy Crudup handles with solemn pathos. Dr. Manhattan is the embodiment of the Ubermensch.
Oh, hey, Nietzsche. I just can't escape my waifu.
He is extremely intelligent to the point where he knows no one can help him. He suffers from a brand of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of his accident. He's more of a force of nature and beyond the scope of humanity than any other thing on the planet. Dr. Manhattan cannot see his own future. He shows Lori the perception of time, but she travels to a dark place. He remarks that's why he keeps the worst from her. Not because he doesn't care, but because he thinks she's not capable of being told the truth. He decides what's in her best interest for her rather than letting her do it herself. In case you were wondering, he does the exact same thing to Rorschach. He decides for Rorschach rather than letting him do it himself. Like teleporting him in the... Even when he tries to reach out to Lori, he shows her that his work is more important. He even remarks,
If you think there's a problem with my attitude, I am prepared to discuss it.
Dr. Manhattan is not suggesting to actually fix his mistakes in relationship with Lori, but to discuss it as if it were up for debate that he was working with Ozymandias while fucking Lori in the bedroom. He also tells Lori she's his only remaining link to humanity. After she leaves, he goes to an interview and answers the questions posed to him. During the interview, he offers anecdotes that are completely out of touch with humanity, and when one reporter insinuates that the cancers his colleagues have been experiencing could be linked to him specifically, he tells them that,
even if that's the case, it's irrelevant. A live human body and a deceased human body have the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no difference.
what can I say but yikes? When he's confronted by his old girlfriend, who also has cancer, he tries to go after her. He becomes surrounded by people and tells them to leave him alone, and they do, because he's got superpowers. And now everyone in that room has cancer, so that sucks! After the interview, he exiles himself to Mars. While there, he monologues about his love for Janie, the old girlfriend, his accident, Silk Spectre. We see how he perceives time as fluid and all at once, not linear like humans see it. He also shows us that the symbol on his head was a sign of respect for the atom. When he shows up to take Laurie to Mars, he forgets that Laurie can't breathe before correcting his mistake. It's another sign of how out of touch he is with humans. Laurie has a confrontation with Dr. Manhattan. She asks why he freaked out on the reporters and why he was surprised she had left if it's all preordained. He's like a puppet going through the motions, but he's the one who can see the strings. When he asks why his perception distresses her, she answers that it's inhuman.
Why would I save a world I no longer have any stake in?
He also tells her that he left Earth when she left him, which should show her he cares, even if in a detached sense. Then Manhattan finds out that the comedian is Laurie's father, and he prevents her death as she breaks down on Mars. He says she's not a joke and resolves that she should smile if he admits he was wrong about miracles, because Laurie's birth was a miracle. They return to New York City, and Dr. Manhattan determines that the nuclear weapons have his signature, that the weapons were made to look like he did it. They teleport to Antarctica, and Manhattan confronts Ozymandias, who he thanks for being able to remember what not knowing feels like. Manhattan disappears, but then Manhattan crashes through the ceiling, telling Ozymandias that he's very disappointed in him. Manhattan tells him that
The world's smartest man poses no more threat to me than does its smartest termite.
when Ozymandias shows him that he's saving the world by having it unite against Manhattan, the latter explains if they try to expose it, they'll be back to where they started. Manhattan understands the plan. He doesn't condemn or condone it. When Rorschach wants to tell the world, Manhattan tells him that he can't.
I can change almost anything. But I can't change human nature.
Then he straight up murders Rorschach. Not that I feel bad for Rorschach. Although I do think that Manhattan does have some remorse for the murder. So much so that he actually exiles himself to a new galaxy. So that brings us to... Like I mentioned earlier, his corpse is one of the best characters in the movie because of how terrible he is. Let me show you. Comedian is a man's man because he's a heavy smoker, a womanizer, and a chauvinist. When he gets killed at his apartment at the beginning of the film, he's kind of fine with that. He proves to be the stoic hero archetype, strong, talented, but mortal. He has zero disregard for women's feelings, to the point that when he confronts Silk Spectre in a powder room and she punches him, he starts beating her into submission and tries to rape her only to get interrupted by Hooded Justice. And then we get to Vietnam. Dr. Manhattan and the comedian descend into Vietnam with Flight of the Valkyries by Richard Wagner playing to start. While Manhattan has a stoic expression as he kills people, the comedian kills alongside him with a giant fucking grin on his face.
You know, if we lost here in Vietnam...
We did in this universe. No one won that war in this timeline. When Manhattan points out that comedian is bitter because they won Vietnam because of the former, the latter says no, he thinks it's hilarious. Manhattan doesn't even bother to correct him on it. I think the worst example of his behavior by far, though, is when a Vietnamese pregnant woman confronts him with a glass bottle to the face, so he shoots her. Manhattan seems horrified as the woman was pregnant, but comedian tells Manhattan that he doesn't care enough, that he's losing touch with humanity because Manhattan could have done something to save her. And because he's a man's man, he also hits protesters, but he can excuse it as he declares it's war. So, let's talk about that mindset, and let's talk about toxic masculinity, my dudes. According to the article, What is Toxic Masculinity?, researchers have defined it in part as a set of behaviors and beliefs that include suppressing emotions or masking distress, maintaining an appearance of hardness and violence as an indicator of power. In other words, toxic masculinity is what can come from teaching boys that they can't express their emotions openly, that they have to be tough all the time, that anything other than that makes them feminine or weak. And yes, before you jump into the comment section and say #NotAllMen and nonsense like that, we know. Like, pointing it out isn't exactly helpful, and it doesn't even fix the problem. Like, all you're doing is shifting blame to the people who are calling it out. So, okay, what does this mean in practice? In The Problem with the Term Toxic Masculinity, Michael Salter explains that Many conservatives allege that charges of toxic masculinity are an attack on manhood itself, at a time when men already face challenges such as higher rates of drug overdose and suicide. Many progressives, meanwhile, contend that the detoxification of masculinity is an essential pathway to gender equality. Amid this heated discourse, newspaper and magazine articles have blamed toxic masculinity for rape, murder, mass shootings, gang violence, online trolling, climate change, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump. Well, I guess you could say that men being men during the Industrial Revolution is part of the reason why climate change is happening now, and because men being men don't want to do anything to fix it, but I'll let that one slide. The rest is true, though. I also want to point out that the story of the film spells out repeatedly, in no uncertain terms, that it is okay for men to disregard the feelings of women, and there's also a cost of toxic masculinity, too. In Who's Afraid of Toxic Masculinity, it's pointed out that the left fears toxic masculinity because, quite simply, it is toxic to all those who are involved in it. The men who practice it, the women who are victimized by it, the women who defend it, the men who are victimized by it, or ostracized for not complying with it or challenging it, the children who are pressured to adapt to it. The right, and the alt-right in particular, fears toxic masculinity because they are the representatives of toxically masculine values and practices. Toxic masculinity is what conservatism defends, and it is that which the alt-right glorifies. The right fears and mocks the concept of toxic masculinity because in its very name it labels what they want to defend, who they are in many cases, as harmful. And that brings us to Ozymandias, or Adrian Veidt, is an outed superhero who everyone knows. Most of the vigilantes gave up the cape when it came time for the Keene Act to go into effect, but by that point everyone knew who Dr. Manhattan was. Adrian and Hollis are the only two superheroes we know that have told the world their identity. Ozymandias, or Adrian Veidt, is an outed superhero who everyone knows. Most of the vigilantes gave up the cape when it came time for the Keene Act to go into effect, but by that point everyone knew who Dr. Manhattan was. Adrian and Hollis are the only two superheroes we know that have told the world their identity. Adrian has a god complex and is an evil mastermind, having orchestrated the events of most of the film, even if the other characters didn't find out until the end. Not to mention, he is the epitome of the phrase, "the road to hell is paved with good intentions." And he also dresses like a fucking nerd, so you can tell he's an arrogant man. When we first meet him, he's the center of attention and receiving praise for his merchandise, touting his work as helping Dr. Manhattan. Daniel comes to visit him, and Adrian makes clear that Rorschach is a sociopath and that the comedian is practically a Nazi, explaining why the comedian's corpse is one of the best things in the movie. And if you look at the map when he's meeting with the Watchmen, you can see what Ozymandias thinks is harming humanity. You know, like minorities wanting rights, immigrants, people who think war is bad, people who don't want to join the military, women trying to own their sexuality. You know, the stuff that politicians are still fighting over. There's a failed assassination attempt on Adrian when he's threatening the competition, where some of that competition gets wiped out. He even kills the scientist who helped him with the Dr. Manhattan machines as a way of not having loose ends. And when Night Owl and Rorschach confront him, he beats them both single-handedly in combat. Adrian explains everything to them. Comedians break down in death, neutralizing Dr. Manhattan with tachyons, that Manhattan does feel things, the assassin, putting Rorschach in prison, and in revealing this plan, he also tells them they can't stop it because it's already happening. He's going to frame Dr. Manhattan for the death of 15 million people while also touting the importance of sacrifice.
Killing millions.
To save billions.
Slow your roll there, Thanos. Which brings us to... oh boy, Rorschach. So, he's basically an incel. He's a chauvinist, a douchebag, albeit a resourceful one, a nihilist, and hates women. When Daniel returns home one night, he finds Rorschach in his kitchen after the door has been kicked in. Rorschach has a complete disregard for consent, personal property, and boundaries. He's also unapologetic, he stalks people, and he imposes his will on everyone around him with no regard for damage or collateral. When things don't go his way, it's never Rorschach's fault. Danny quit. Richard Nixon stopped the Watchmen. It's always anyone but him. He also has a very black and white way of thinking.
Attack on one is attack on all of us.
And he's horrifically detached from humanity without Dr. Manhattan's excuses. He slut-shames.
Silhouette, murdered. A victim of her own indecent lifestyle.
Get fucked, you sociopath! Resorts to name-calling, and even other characters are aware that Rorschach is a sociopath. Rorschach also idolizes the comedian, who he believes saw society's true face and that the comedian understood that humans are savages. When he sees Laurie with Daniel, he automatically assumes she's having an affair, and that's why Manhattan exiled himself.
My spotless gloves. My face. Putting them on, I abandoned my disguise. Heard woman scream. First bubbling note of city's evening chorus.
Rorschach has a lot of blood on his hands, so it's far from spotless. He also considers the Rorschach mask as his true face, and we see that when he's without the mask. Because he stalks people. Even at comedian's funeral. When he gets caught at a former supervillain's apartment, framing him for the death of the guy, he refuses to surrender to the police, even making a makeshift flamethrower to fight them. He's caught and revealed to be Walter Kovacs as he is sent to jail. When he's interrogated by a doctor, he gives typical answers, though the audience sees his flashbacks, a dead animal, his mother hitting him, beating up bullies, and he has no remorse for murder or hurting people. When he's put in his cell, he remarks,
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you.
You're locked in here with me.
proceeding to take guys out one by one until Silk Spectre and Night Owl show up to get him out of prison. Before leaving, he murders a guy and gets his face back from the doctor who interrogated him. And he drops his journal off The New Frontiersman, which is the basis for the HBO Watchmen show. We'll get to it. He and Night Owl confront Ozymandias, but when the others agree to keep Ozymandias' plan secret, Rorschach leaves to tell the world. Manhattan murders him, but he does tell Daniel,
Never compromise. Not even in the face of Armageddon.
before his murder. Rorschach is another example of toxic masculinity. In Who's Afraid of Toxic Masculinity, we get numerous examples. Norms, beliefs, and behaviors often associated with toxic masculinity include hyper-competitiveness, individualistic self-sufficiency, often to the point of isolation nowadays, but still, and more commonly in the pre-internet days, in a parochial, patriarchal sense of the male role as breadwinner and autocrat of the family. Tendency towards or glorification of violence, real or digital, directed at people or any living or non-living things. Chauvinism, paternalism towards women, sexism, male superiority, misogyny, hatred of women. Rigid concepts of sexual/gender identity and roles. Heteronormativity, belief in the naturalness and superiority of heterosexuality and cisgenderedness. Entitlement to sexual attention from women. Sexual objectification of women, and the infantilization of women, treating women as immature and lacking awareness or agency in desiring meekness and a youthful appearance. But all these heroes have something in common. In Men of Steel, Rorschach, Theweleit, and Watchmen's Deconstructed Masculinity, we are told, through its cast of male heroes, Watchmen deconstructs the superhero genre by rewriting masculine tropes such as vigilantism and patriotism, and by exposing the inherent contradictions with these gender-bound tropes, from the fascist undercurrents of violent patriotism to the often hinted sexual dysfunction of the costume fetish variety. But specifically, in talking about Rorschach, the author tells us Rorschach's masculinity is closely tied to his nationalism. Idolizing President Truman and the lost America of the past, where men believed in a day's work for a day's pay, Rorschach views himself as the true patriot, the one who has seen the true face of New York, and by association, all of America. He's also primarily characterized by his adamant refusal to quit or compromise, even in the face of Armageddon, which is how he separates himself from the failures others have become. He describes himself as free from fear or weakness or lust as he puts on his mask, his true face, in essence stating that he is in complete control of himself and his desires as the true masculine hero should be. And importantly, Mervi Miettinen, the author, tells us it is revealing that Rorschach, whose uncompromising yet contradictory morality leads him to kill rapists and despise whores, idolizes the comedian, whose attempt to rape the original Silk Spectre is viewed by Rorschach as a moral lapse of a great man, a hyper-masculine display of power and violence that is to be admired rather than condemned. The comedian represents a real man to Rorschach, whereas all the other heroes of his cohort are seen as either failures or otherwise corrupt. The comedian fights US wars in both the South Pacific and in Vietnam, and handles the Iranian hostage situation in 1980. So it's not hard to understand why some people liken him to a hero, even though he's probably the least heroic out of all of them, including Comedian's corpse. The movie highlights that regardless of your powers, abilities, and skills, they are still just people with problems and issues. They refuse to treat themselves and their traumas because of their identities as superheroes. Brittany McNamara breaks it down in The Cost of Toxic Masculinity that the price tag of all this is an estimated $15.7 billion every year. The $15.7 billion figure is the bare minimum costs associated with these behaviors, according to the report. The real cost, the report notes, would likely be much higher because of the age restrictions on this set of data, limited categories, and the fact that it's impossible to completely reflect the cause of the emotional tolls of these behaviors taken on others. But she also contends, it might seem crass to quantify the harm of toxic masculinity in dollars lost from workers impacted by it, or even to need to put a dollar amount on it at all. But despite previous research and emotional appeals, society's definition of being a man hasn't much changed. But how can we combat this? Gillette seems to have an answer with a commercial. In an article titled "The Real Problem with Toxic Masculinity is that it assumes there is only one way of being a man," Ashley Morgan tells us Gillette's advert appears to suggest that behaviors that some men regularly engage in, either in public or the workplace, including bullying, unwanted touching, and catcalling, is inappropriate. What is more, the message seems to be that these behaviors should be explained as being inappropriate to boys in childhood. And a lot of people were like, hey, wait a minute, but Gillette was right to call out the problem. Because it's toxic. There's costs. Morgan explains, but women are not the sole victims of toxic masculinity. Men can be affected just as deeply by these acts. Even if men are not directly targeted by an act of toxic masculinity, the culture of it can force them to suppress their own feelings in order to fit in with narrow expectations of masculinity that suggest emotions are weak. So if that's the case, what can we do? Well, Morgan has a rather good suggestion. Rather than engaging in toxic practices, men who are in privileged positions should be able to recognize that they can be agents for change to the benefit of all. This is a message for everyone. There is no new war on men, and there is no need for anyone to prove their masculinity through aggression, and it's time to put an end to toxic masculinity. Because women cannot call attention to it themselves. As for Watchmen, it's not hard to understand why entitled young men see themselves in Rorschach, a character who was tormented as a young boy, reviled by his peers, and forced to turn to vigilantism to achieve his goals. Dom Nero points out, and so many Watchmen fans have no idea what it's really about. And people are afraid of it. Bryant W. Sculos points it out in Who's Afraid of Toxic Masculinity by saying, Everyone is afraid of toxic masculinity, whether they realize it or not. By afraid, I don't literally mean that everyone is fearful of it in an affective or emotional sense, but rather that everyone sees toxic masculinity as a threat to themselves or society more broadly. I mean this quite literally. Both the left and the right view toxic masculinity as a threat, whether it is the material and ideational realities that the concept refers to, this is what the left opposes, or the concept itself, this is what the right fears. And here's the thing, this is not about policing language or political correctness. While our words certainly carry the power to justify, normalize, reproduce, and exacerbate certain structures of oppression and exploitation, it is those structures against which the critique of toxic masculinity and toxic masculine capitalism is directed, Sculos points out. So next time you watch this movie and ask yourself, who should I idolize? The answer shouldn't be Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, or even Night Owl. All these people have qualities that you can identify with, but idolizing should be associated with something good, and none of these guys are good. Watchmen is a study in masculinity, but we can use those lessons and make the world better by ourselves, regardless of whether we have a Dr. Manhattan watching us. Oh my, yes. Be really angry at those commenters. How dare they? How dare they upset your mama? Very good girl. Say, Mommy, they can't upset you. I love you. You're my favorite. Yeah. Yeah.